Hey, curious people. You're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the self-led sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. It's hard to feel self-led in bed when we do not feel at home in our bodies, when we judge our bodies harshly and feel shameful about them. In this episode of the podcast, I speak with Marcella Cox, a certified IFS therapist who specializes in treating eating disorders, disordered eating, body shame, and trauma. Something I really appreciated talking with Marcella is the depth of her kindness and compassion toward the parts of ourselves that take on the job of keeping us out of our bodies. She invites embodiment throughout the episode and brings in the role cultural influences like patriarchy and capitalism play in our relationship to body trust and connection. We explore the overlaps between eating and sexuality and consider the profound impact of slowing down, noticing our bodies, and tuning in to what we really feel and want. A little more about Marcella. She recently contributed the chapter on IFS and disordered eating in the book Altogether Us, integrating the IFS model with key modalities, communities, and trends. She's on the staff of Susan McConnell, developer of Somatic IFS, and is an approved IFS clinical consultant. Marcella leads workshops, trainings, and retreats, and her certifications as a body trust provider, daring way facilitator, and mindful self-compassion teacher also inform her professional work. Marcella is the founder of Kindful Body, a collaboration of experienced eating disorder professionals providing online therapy and nutrition counseling throughout California. She also co-founded the IFS Telehealth Collective, a multi-state mental health group practice dedicated to providing high-quality IFS therapy online. I invite you to join us for this many-layered conversation. Marcella, I am so excited to have a conversation with you today on Self-Led in Bed podcast.
Honored to be here with you today, Patty, and explore this topic with you.
I have been curious about so many things related to the overlap of your specialization and my specialization. But before we go further with that, I just wanted to ask you what parts are here for you as we step into this conversation.
Well, I do have one that I was aware of just as you hit the record button. That's a little shy. And I noticed just a little energy of like a little shyness coming in. And then I'm also noticing another one that's maybe concerned about some awkwardness around this topic.
Mm-hmm.
And a third that's like, oh, great. I can't wait to get started. So this is why I love IFS because we can have all this complexity
Mm-hmm.
and be present with it. So thanks for having me check in.
Yes, and welcome to your parts. I can appreciate each of them and just wondering if you or they would need anything from you or from me as we step
Mm.
in. I just want to validate how common it is to feel some awkwardness around the topic of sexuality and also how rich it is and exciting and
Yeah, they really appreciate the validation and the welcome of them and me,
Mhm.
and they are relaxing back. So you and I can be in this conversation.
Yeah. I've worked a lot with my own parts around that, and even stepping into the space of this podcast, parts that still are curious sometimes about the edges and what is it okay to talk about and what isn't, and how much of my own self-disclosure do I want to share here, and how much does that need to stay very private? So I'm just noticing some of those parts that show up. And it's interesting to me because I'm pretty used to exploring those parts around sex and sexuality. But our topic today has to do with food and eating and bodies. And it's interesting because there's another set of parts that are feeling that out. What is comfortable for us to share or speak of in that realm. And I'm curious to hear what's your experience perhaps with people stepping into talking about it, like the vulnerability, like do you sense this is a vulnerable, like your areas of specialization are vulnerable for people to talk about?
I think so. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing like what's alive in your system and how you've worked with these different parts and the edges of where they're comfortable going, where they're not comfortable going, and honoring what feels right within your system. And I feel a greater comfort talking about food and bodies because of this is the area where I've spent most of my career, and less comfortable talking about sex. And although with clients, we're talking about that often, and yet in this forum, it feels a little more uncomfortable to my system.
Mhm.
uh, as you were saying, like what do you self-disclose, where are your edges, what's okay to discuss, what's not okay to
Mhm.
discuss.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting exploration, and I do believe that a lot of it comes from these cultural burdens, these legacy burdens, personal burdens that my system has absorbed about, is it okay to have these conversations in public as opposed to behind closed doors with a client or with a girlfriend. And yeah, so here we are in a podcast
Mhm.
exploring it together, finding
Yes.
our way.
Yes, and trying to find that self-led place, right? To be able to have
Mhm.
some grounding in our core humanity, that core life energy in us as we maybe speak for parts that aren't so comfortable or share our learned wisdom, because I think we both have the privilege of witnessing other people's and facilitating other people going really deep and getting to know the parts of themselves that activate in these areas. And I appreciate you naming the cultural legacy burdens. And I feel like the same ones impact the areas that we work in. And we have one body, right? We have one body, and that body is subject to so many layers of messaging about what it's supposed to do or look like or feel like, or is it here for others? Is it here for ourselves? Where does pleasure fit in? And depending on what identities we hold, what size our body is, what genders we identify with, the script can change quite a bit.
Yeah, I really appreciate you naming it in the way that you have. And it's part of being a body trust provider, right? We're taking a excuse me, a social justice lens to seeing these issues and seeing the hierarchy of bodies in our culture around who gets care, who has resources. It's really a political discussion in some respects, that on a cultural level, but then it affects us personally, and it can affect our relationship to our bodies, all these parts around, am I deserving to have hunger, am I deserving to have pleasure? All these things get exiled, and our parts start to organize around all the cultural messages and also lived experience. I mean, we also, not only the messages, but people, and there's a bias in our culture around weight. for
Mhm.
instance,
Mhm.
and it doesn't impact everybody equally, but because we have this bias and we see the harm that is done to people in larger bodies, so our parts then are like, I don't want that harm done to me. And so they start restricting and over exercising. So it affects all of us,
Mhm.
right? It's not only the discrimination that certain people feel around this.
Yeah, there's a few things in there I'm picking up on. One is that hierarchy of bodies. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit, or even where, in your experience, what kinds of bodies feel like they are more subject to exiling or shaming as compared to other bodies. I know you mentioned larger bodies, and in your chapter, which I happened to review last night, your chapter in the book All Together Us, and it was really wonderful. And I noted a few phrases actually were right where one of them was. You use the phrase embodied journeys. Our embodied journeys are directly related to our social location. And also
Yeah.
use the phrase disrupted embodiment. So maybe all of this is circling around a similar thing.
Yeah. And the our embodiment based on our social location, that's from the work of Neva Paran. And she studied teen girls, and she what she noticed is based on body size, based on body color, based on class, your ability to be take up space and be in your body and feel okay in your body was based on these external factors. And that leads us to this hierarchy of bodies that we see in our culture. We see it with racism. We see it with sexism, like who gets to take up space, whose bodies have privilege and whose bodies don't have privilege. And they're intersecting identities around that. And so the more that you fall outside of the dominant culture, the less privilege you have, you fall down that hierarchy. And then there's, I mean, from a IFS lens, then these parts will come in and help you by keeping you out of your body, right? They're protecting you. And that's disrupted embodiment. That's really painful to feel that you don't belong, that you, and to have harm done towards you just because of your body. And our parts then start taking us out of our body because of it, because that is a painful experience. And in my work with my clients, their body is the last place they want to be, right? And so we work with those parts first, right? We don't bypass any of those protectors.
Mm.
We go slowly and really understand their fears and honor them. And sometimes that can be a radical act of when clients can get a sense of the parts that are saying no and having that no honored. So, whoa,
Mm.
how often does that happen in life where they can say no and have it respected and heard and then met with some curiosity and that it's totally okay, that we don't need to bypass it and just we want to get to know it. We know it's there for a reason, right?
That's so powerful. So a no from a part who's saying, no, you can't be in your body. Is that what you mean? Like a part
Mhm.
that's, and again, in IFS, we have this notion that we have protector parts of ourselves that have jobs that help us to function, and it's function in a context. So parts who know that it feels terrible to be maligned or teased or fat shamed or in any way oppressed based on physical appearance, and then another part saying, no, you can't even be in your body. It feels terrible to be there. And as opposed to trying to get people to just change and be different, this approach that you're speaking to, and which is very aligned with IFS, is, oh, this is happening for a reason. And what I really appreciate that you're taking in is that social justice view that these aren't just abstract things that people have lived experience of harm being done. And so it makes sense to not want to experience those things. I guess, and that parts want to keep us safe by, I think, sometimes in contradictory ways. I know you mentioned polarizations in your chapter, right? That there could be different
Mhm.
competing strategies for how to be safe in a body.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and the approach I take in working with clients is thematic IFS. And so that no, being able to, for a client to be able to express the no and in an embodied way and without bypassing it and even celebrating that it can say no. Often then there's some relaxation, it can invite in some unblending of that part to then get to know the no better and work with that. And then you were asking about the polarizations, and absolutely, when I'm working with clients, so many polarizations about food and taking care of your body, and we the polarizations about parts that want to control appearance and control what someone eats and how they move and how they're perceived, and those hardworking protectors, right, that become burdened from not only cultural messages but personal experiences as well, and intergenerational experiences or legacy burdens that are passed down. But then the reaction to those controlling parts and the out of control, the firefighter reactive behavior that happens in counterbalance to the control. So the more that someone tries to control, the more out of control parts become. And often there's the critics that are present as well. When we think about our bodies, like we're not born into this world hating our bodies or dissatisfied with our bodies, right? This is all it's all from our culture and our lived experience.
That's very true. Just sitting with that a minute, that we're not born that way. And then you realize just from the minute someone even sees their first ultrasound image, and there's all sorts of meanings that come in, and particularly related initially to gender and people's assumptions about what kind of child they'll have based on gender. And then all the messages around food and eating. People who may be a little less familiar, I'm just curious if you could give examples of what a manager or firefighter, particularly firefighter, might do, those kinds of parts might do or say in relation to body image and food. And then maybe we can see where our two areas meet.
Sure. Well, and sometimes the you I've worked with clients where there can be really restrictive managers around food and exercise trying to control someone's body, but their firefighters might not be about food. Their firefighters actually might be around sex and or spending or overworking, or it might be around food, it might be around binging or purging or compulsory exercise. So it might be around food or their body.
Mhm.
And when we can really work with these parts and understand the protective nature of what they're doing and really befriend them, is when they can show us what they're protecting, as we know from the IFS
Mhm.
model, which can be quite profound work in that unburdening process of all that they're holding. And it's always, what fascinates me is it's always complex. It's never really about, oh, I just want to be healthy, or I just want to look good, or I just want to, right there. There's always these burdens, these deep burdens underneath these extreme protectors.
Interesting. I'm curious about that notion that the managers and firefighters might use might focus on different areas, right? So some managers that are focused on managing body size or weight or exercise or things like that may be very strong in the system. And then if we think of firefighters as the parts of ourselves that want to give relief from pain or stress or pressure or
Hmm.
lack of pleasure sometimes,
Hmm.
then they
Yeah.
might turn to sexuality, perhaps as an
Hmm.
outlet, but maybe in a more compulsive way, would you say?
Yeah. A more compulsive way, or it could be substance, right? That's another place where clients might go. There's always, with that polarization of the extreme restricting, there's always a part that binges, and it might not be on food.
Mhm.
That's what I found in my experience. Sometimes it's food, and sometimes it's something else.
Yeah. So when I work with people, one of the things that we're often paying attention to when it comes to sex and sexuality is how safe are you feeling in this moment? And even having a conversation about it. And then what are the things in the external world that are impacting how safe you're feeling? And I use the word safe. It's one of those six S words, not to say we can never know something is completely safe, but what is it that allows us to feel trusting enough, relaxed enough to
Mhm.
soften for those protector parts to relax and allow us to really be present? And if we're vigilant because we're not in a private scenario, or maybe we're with a partner who isn't kind, or we sense the partner is critical about our body, there can be external reasons that it doesn't feel safe. But then there's also internal reasons, like the internal critics. Well, once you stop being so preoccupied with taking care of maybe everyone in your family or your work, and you slow down and you're in an intimate situation with a partner, now you're confronted with your own inner voices that come up when you reveal your body or when you are close to another body and what parts show up there.
I love the phrase safe enough. And with some self energy and being able to work with your parts and know the boundaries of what is okay and what isn't, like having that consent is so important. And there needs to be a certain level of presence, a certain level of listening for what are those cues. And you brought up like the body image component of like, oh, with sex, right? Where we might have those critics that are showing up this very in a probably in a very similar way when someone is struggling with body image, and I often think of it as body shame when they're struggling with eating issues. They often go hand in hand. And the body shame, there's often parts that are objectifying yourself, right? We have those experiences of being objectified often in our life of what our body looks like. And so being able to work with those self objectifiers is really important. And understanding how they're trying to help us is important. And what I love about Susan McConnell's work is like bringing in embodiment, right? Bringing in all these practices that bring you home to your body. And that is the antidote to body image, is this the subjective experience of what's going on. That can never be wrong when we can be in connection to the energy that's flowing through us and the parts that are showing up, and having some self energy and being in our body is, and that's where we can experience that pleasure, right? That we need that embodiment to be present. And it, it's a moment to moment experience of that connection. Like, how aware are you of what's happening inside? And even as maybe as listeners are tuning in right now, how embodied are you? If you're sitting, are you aware of the chair behind or beneath you? Are you aware of your back body being supported? If you're walking, are you aware of like your feet moving on the ground, your heart beating?
I love that. And I love how powerful those simple reminders are. And here, this is something is such an important part of, I feel, how I live. And it's so easy to slip out of it. So you're just giving those prompts right now. My body was like happy to be remembered for a minute. It's just so easy to teleport out out of the body. And
Yeah.
that reminder that we can't feel much when we're outside of when we're blended with our critical parts. And I don't know if you're familiar, but in the sex therapy world, I believe it was Masters and Johnson who coined the term spectatoring, and that
Hmm.
a difficulty often that people are having when they're not able to feel much pleasure, or they're getting caught up in a loop of frustration with their body not doing something they wanted to do, for instance, and then they get into what they called spectatoring. So it was watching your own sexual performance, like a performance,
Hmm.
and being that theater critic, being the critic, and
Yeah.
then how do
Yeah.
you have an experience when you're the audience and the actor at the same time?
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And I have heard of that, but I hadn't considered how it really takes you out of your body. And of course, it makes so much sense that you wouldn't be able to experience pleasure if you're not in your body.
Mhm.
You're watching, like that part of you is watching your performance. The clients that I work with, often there's a behavior that they do called body checking. And this can be like weighing yourself daily or looking in the mirror a lot and scrutinizing like a certain part of yourself or trying on different clothes. It could be pinching yourself, like, okay,
Mhm.
how is my body? So it's almost as you were sharing about this phenomenon, it's very similar in some
Mhm.
ways of like, oh,
Mhm.
how is my body doing? Right. It's a way,
Mhm.
it's that anxiety around how am I doing? Am I fitting in? Is my body
Mhm.
okay as it is? We're looking for some external validation that it's okay. And that totally takes you out of your body, right?
Mhm.
Based on looking at how does it appear as opposed to
Right.
how's it doing, checking in with what's going on inside.
It's yes, we're the same people moving through the day, right? I'm just imagining someone waking up in the morning, and how are you, even listeners might want to feel into this a bit. First, waking up in the morning, where are we in relation to our bodies? Is it a pleasure to wake up? Is there some touching of your body to wake up? Where am I? I notice when I wake up in the morning, there's something about, I don't know, it's just a moment. There's a moment there before the whole day starts where it's me and my body in a way
Hmm.
that it doesn't tend to be the rest of the day. And maybe I'm sweaty, maybe I'm very comfortable. Maybe I'm still tired, but there's something about a moment of just being much more connected to my physical self in this way. And then the day gets going, right? But there's all these moments when I'm in the shower. Am I able to really enjoy the shower and feel the water and the heat and the things that I like about a shower, or is my mind racing and planning my day, or maybe it's both and that's okay. But I'm just picturing moving through the day, and then there's food choices, right? Then there's breakfast and what parts show up around that, and the rest of the day with food and work, and then at whatever point there might be any kind of opportunity for sexual engagement, whether that's solo sexual engagement or sexual engagement with another person, or maybe just walking down the street and having a moment of really feeling empowered or feeling sexy, or feeling really, like you said, just disconnected from the body, or like it's not safe to feel those feelings or embody an empowered kind of sexual self when you're walking down the street. It's like we're the
Mhm.
same people. We tend to, I guess there's something about how the mental health field is constructed that we have these specializations in different areas, which is really important because there's nuance to working in the
Mhm.
areas, but it could almost, I don't know, it's almost easy to forget sometimes that it's all the same body and
All
we're
the
the
same
same
body.
people. And it's the same parts a lot of times that are showing up
Yeah.
around these different body functions and emotional relationships, but they're
Yeah.
organizing around a different activity or, yeah.
Yeah. I love what you're saying around like, oh, just noticing the ebb and flow of embodiment throughout the day based on the external what's happening,
Mhm.
right? Like for me, when I am getting up in the morning and just feeling the cold tile under my feet, under my bare feet, it's like, ooh, like a little exhilaration that I get of like, okay, here's another day and I'm here.
Mhm.
Uh, and then times that would like all these parts blend and we're really not embodied. And you brought up this piece around like, oh, sex and being with others and like, how do we do embodied connection? And this is, I'll self-disclose, I'm starting to see an somatic experiencing body worker. And I went in for a session yesterday and she was asking like, okay, how's this me sitting across from you, like the proximity? And I had a couple parts showing up, and so I was naming those parts, and she invited me to like embody them and just like slowly embody them. And then it was a different way of working with them, which is cool. And there was one part she's like, oh, can maybe that part would like some support, and came, and that was fine, right? To give my shoulder a little support to know that it wasn't alone. And
And I see you, just people may not see that you were touching your shoulder with your hand. So was that
yeah,
like tactile support? So there was
yeah,
some
there was a
touch there.
little touch on my shoulder, and then after working with these two parts, right? Like I had a part that was like really excited to, okay, I get to do something new, and I was excited, and then this part that was like, oh, not sure, and that was in my shoulder. And what I wanted to work on was my jaw and like some tightness in my jaw. I was curious about it, and at that point we didn't have much time left. And so she invited me to do this exercise that Peter Levine developed, where you like open your jaw slightly to the point of you feeling some sensation and close it slightly. And it's done very slowly. And all the parts that came up around that is like almost the most intimate thing is to open your mouth in front of another human you don't know. Like, so I was like, whoa, okay, there's a trailhead for me around that of how do you be in embodied connection to yourself and in relation like in a relationship to another. So it's hard, it's hard, and we can have a ton of parts showing up, and that is with another professional who's trying to help me. And just imagine someone you're in with a partner, and are they embodied and are they connected and present, and how is that connection? So it's a rich area for discussion about embodied connection and intimacy,
Yes.
really
Yeah,
being
thank
seen.
you. Absolutely. And I really appreciate that personal example on how in that even in a professional connection where there's touch and revealing of something intimate like or slow mouth movement, how much vulnerability was there and how
Yeah,
and my sense is that there's something about being really present while that was happening, right? We could open our mouths in front of people in other contexts, but there's something about being present that
yeah,
increases the vulnerability.
totally,
Yeah.
totally, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for helping me deepen that. Yeah, it was knowing that someone was seeing me open my jaw, right, slowly, and tracking it and being with me in that.
Yeah.
But there was some deep vulnerability. It's like, whoa.
Mhm.
And to feel and to be with that and to work with that edge of like, oh, what does feel okay? Actually, what my system felt better was to not make eye contact when I was doing that. That she could be there holding space, but for me to not, yeah, not, I don't know, the eyes were
Mhm. Yeah.
a little bit too vulnerable for my system. So I honored what was
Yeah.
coming up for myself.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I just love that example of this word embodiment. I feel like is sometimes a little hard to wrap one's understanding around. It can be a little bit abstract, but I think examples are so helpful with that. And
Mhm.
that when our parts relax enough to let us be alert in the moment and aware of what we're feeling, then we're more able to discern what's okay with us and what isn't. And in a different scenario or whatever scenario, to then have access to our voice. So when we're talking about embodiment, the specific examples can be very helpful. And this idea, maybe listeners can think of a time when you did something with presence and without presence. And I often use food and eating as an analogy for people around sexuality because there's so much similarity there. There's a
Mhm.
biological function, there's a pleasure function, there's lots of social rules and expectations around it. So if we're eating something, maybe even something we like a lot, maybe we're eating ice cream, but we're not present. We could eat ice cream, maybe even a lot of ice cream, but not necessarily really taste it very much or
Mhm.
really have the pleasure of eating it. Because if we're blended with a part who's really anxious or in a hurry or thinking about 10 other things that have to be done,
Or I shouldn't be eating the
or
ice
I
cream,
shouldn't be
right?
eating it, casting self punishing while it's being eaten, right? All
Yeah,
those things don't allow the opportunity to just be present and in a visceral experience of what it feels like and tastes like to eat the ice cream.
absolutely. And then, so then the question is, if you're not present while you're eating the ice cream, do you get the satisfaction or pleasure from eating ice cream?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Right.
how is that experience for you? Is it different if you're present versus not present?
Exactly. And then the analogy sexually would be if you're not present, you might be doing something sexually that maybe at times is very pleasurable, but if you're not really there, there's going through the motions aspect. And you
Mhm.
had used a phrase in the book chapter of engaging in, this was in relation to disrupted embodiment, that people might be engaging in sexual activities with no desire or pleasure. Of course, there's a lot of
Mhm.
reasons someone might engage in sexual activity mindfully that doesn't bring desire, that doesn't have desire or pleasure. I think there's a lot of different goals that parts might want to accomplish through engaging sexually. But when it's not mindful, it's not a conscious choice, and there's a disconnect. So there's not really an awareness of what feels good or feels bad. That could be difficult in the moment because then you're just not, you're missing out on what might potentially feel good and maybe a little more distant from a partner. And then sometimes real harm is done. I work with people who maybe have spent years engaging in sexual activities that they don't enjoy and have
Mhm.
been checked out. And
Right.
then something happens where they want to feel those things again, or the straw breaks the camel's back, and maybe the partner had no idea that they weren't getting
Mhm.
pleasure because they looked like they were happy. They might have been, sometimes people are even having orgasms, but they're not subjectively enjoying, which is sometimes
Yeah.
hard for people to wrap their mind around that too, that something, even though physically it seems like it would feel good, when there's a lot of disconnection or a sense of not choosing that activity,
Mhm.
it could be not satisfying. And so sometimes a partner is blindsided when the person wakes up one day and is like, I just can't do this anymore. I'm not enjoying this. This doesn't feel good. And they're like, but you always seem to like it. And they're like, no, I didn't. Like, I wasn't there. Like, some
Mhm.
part of me told me I should be doing this. And I was doing it to be a good partner. And then that could be really devastating to the
Mhm.
other partner who's like, oh, all these years I thought you were happy. And, you know, it's honest. Like, and that can be a juncture where there's the potential to get real and maybe way through some difficult truths, but then actually become more authentically present and connected.
Mhm. Yeah.
Or it can just be scary, and sometimes people's parts panic about that and don't know how to get in alignment again. But this notion of embodiment, there's a price tag to be, there's a cost immediate in the moment, and there could be a
Mhm.
long-term cost of all that time spent not listening and feeling and taking care of our bodies in a way that we can only do when we hear the voice of the body.
Yeah, the wisdom inside. This idea of disrupted embodiment, like knowing that these parts that are disrupting our embodiment have a good reason for doing what they're doing. And and you didn't put a name on us of grief, but when we start to see all the ways that we weren't in our body, and then the things that we allowed to have happen to our bodies, there can be a lot of grief, right? And a lot of the work I do with clients is grief work. Uh,
Oh, interesting. So that would be once
yeah.
they start to feel more embodied, then the grief can surface.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And the grief around what they didn't get, what they, right, why they turned towards food or fixated on their bodies or turned away from food or dissociated from their bodies. And the years of that, there's another layer
Yeah.
of grief of like, oh, I haven't, there's so much of my life that I lost because of this. And yeah, and then you were speaking to like the impact on your relationships, right? When you're more in your body and you can feel, okay, this is an alignment and this isn't, and the impact that can have relationally when you speak for it, and how to figuring out how do you move forward? How do you move forward when you tell your husband or your wife or partner that actually this doesn't feel good and I'm not happy with it? And then they call Patty.
And
Uh,
yeah, and I could share something here too. And it's certainly not necessarily all or nothing in these areas. And something I'm passionate about is talking about the impact of menopause, perimenopause, and
mhm.
postmenopause, and the changes that can have. I think it's something that we don't get enough education about, and it's often felt before it's known what's going on. But
Mhm.
I know for myself, when things were going pretty smoothly, I was pretty comfortable in my body. We didn't need to have those kinds of conversations. But I gradually realized over time, as I went through menopause, that things didn't feel good that used to feel good. And I was grateful that I had done the work I've done to be in touch with my body, because even then it took a little bit to notice the changes. But there was a point where,
Mhm.
gosh, now I'm having pain that I didn't have before. Things aren't feeling good. And there was a period of time, without realizing it, of just tolerating and
Mhm.
enduring. And then listening to my body was the key to figuring that out and realizing, I like to your point about saying no, like saying, okay, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to change, but I need to say this isn't working right now. And we
Mhm.
need to stop and we need to do something different. And there was some a lot of sensitive communication that needed to happen internally in my
Mhm.
system between me and my spouse to sort out, well, what's going on here? What's about our relationship? What's my body? What's menopause or perimenopause? There's so many things to sort out. And I think with the body that can happen at whether it's related to pregnancies or in a for men as well at different stages of life, a male
Mhm.
sexual response changes with age and health status and medications. And there is, I think for men, it's often not fully appreciated the extent of body pressure men feel to look a certain way in their bodies and to show up with this very visible sexual organ and have it do the thing it's supposed to do,
Mhm.
and the amount of
Yeah.
shame that can be internalized when it isn't. So
Yeah.
I'm just musing, I guess, moving around a little from
Well,
topic to topic here.
you're raising a lot of really good points about like as we age, both women and men, as we age and our bodies are changing. And yeah, there isn't a lot of information about menopause and how women's that's starting to change, but um yeah, there's been a lot of misinformation about hormone replacement and things along those lines and what the research is showing now. Um, and we have all these parts that are reacting to the biology and those changes, and you're naming like the shame, right? That because we have these expectations, it's not normalized in our culture that these changes, it's not talked about, and this is
Mhm.
what we're doing, right? We're starting to have these conversations to
Mhm.
kind of destigmatize um, what happens
Mhm.
to our bodies and to normalize it. And so we go around with a ton of shame, thinking, oh, we're the only ones, or I have this expectation. I have to always be this performer in bed. And our bodies get old and they work differently. And we do need that external support around those changes as well. Um, yeah.
Thank you for pulling the theme out of that. And part of the passion I have for this topic and for starting the podcast is exactly that, just to add another voice to the conversation, to try to give permission to talk about these topics and internally have internal conversations, to be able to talk more easily as a therapist. It's not always easy, even as a professional, to talk about these things, and as for clients to have that space. And then just in life, to be able to appreciate these topics and not only be, it's, there's the biological side. So we need good information and good science and good innovations and interventions. And then there's the psychological side, which involves all these different parts of ourselves who need attention. And even just being able to know that it's okay to feel 10 different ways. And it's amazing how powerful it is to be able to name those 10 different ways. And that can open up space. So when I talk about safety, or that, again, that 6 S's runway, there's that notion that when we can communicate honestly and authentically, that creates more of that feeling of connectedness and self energy and safety. And then once we're
Yeah.
more, that helps us often to get more present. It's often not about changing those realities, but just being able to be honest about our experience. And then that sometimes allows sensuality to be in the
Mm.
field. oh, okay, now I'm
Mm.
relaxed. Now I can really feel how nice it is to be touched or to touch another or
Mm.
touch myself. Or there's just like more presence to the
Yeah,
experience of the body.
yeah.
So,
I first of all, appreciate how you were sharing like your intention for the podcast, and this is a gift, Patty. I'm so happy that you're using your voice and putting this out there into the world because it is so needed that we're having these conversations. And yeah, bringing in the touch, bringing in that the sensuality. And when we think about it, we're born into hands of another, right? Like, and we need touch, right? Like our, as little ones, like that touch, right? Affects how we attach and that bonding. And as a culture, I've heard some different studies like around boys and girls and touch and like when it gets disconnected and then when there's harm in touch as well. And so we can have a very complicated relationship with touch. And it's so important to work with those parts around touch and receiving touch and giving touch. And recently I was with Carrie Gardner and like she talks about bringing your energy home to your body. And then I was doing a consult group and I was on somatic IFS and it was around attune touch. So each week we do a different one of the embodiment practices. And I just offered a experiential exercise on some attuned touch and first some unblending and then bringing some self energy into your hands and then just for a few moments just seeing if there's a part of your body that would just like a little touch, right? Maybe it's your heart, maybe shoulder, tension from the day, wherever on your body. And this one participant shared about when she just did a little bit of touch, she had a memory of something that came up that was similar to a client that she had just seen. And the touch brought her home to her body, to her own experience. I just thought that was so powerful. Like that little nugget really stuck with me about like how touch can just bring us back home. It's we can be embodied and feel that touch, the all that is revealed in touch. It's quite a powerful, I don't want to say intervention, but experience. It's an experience.
experience. Yeah.
It's an experience.
Absolutely. And I know there's so much more we could say here, and I feel like we could continue this conversation. And I'm also aware that maybe it's time to wind down for today soon, but I wanted to just see if there was anything we haven't touched on that you wanted to speak for, and then I'll ask you as well to share anything you'd want people to know about what you're up to, if they would want to connect with you, how they could do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that opportunity, and I appreciate you saying anything you want me to touch on, and that words can touch us. Doesn't have to be like physical touch. It can be imagined touch. So just even putting that out there, we can be touched by the elements, right? Feeling the sun on our skin or the cool breeze. And I don't know if there's anything I want to end with. I guess one thing that came up in our conversation was this idea of embodiment, and I just wanted to say like embodiment isn't like a destination. It's not like where it's on or it's off. It's a continual life journey of embodiment. And and really it's about awareness. The more we're aware of what's unfolding in our bodies, the more embodied we are. And it runs along a continuum and it's a moment to moment experience. And so to just put that out there that there are times that I think we all are not embodied and for good reason. And there, what embodiment offers is the chance to feel that sensuality, feel that sexuality, feel that safety, all of your six S's, right, are embodied experience. And life lives through us, through our bodies, right? That joy, that life force, that connection, it's richer when we're in our bodies. And so just wanting to invite folks to appreciate those protectors that keep you out of your body. And then there's also the hope that there's times that we can be in our bodies and that we can be home. We can bring our energy home to our bodies and live a more embodied life.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcella. So, how can people connect with you or learn more from you?
I am on social media with Kindful Body, my group practice in California. So if you're interested in more resources on food in your body, we have a newsletter we put out each month. We create some content for folks who are curious about their relationship with food in their body. And we're on Instagram and Facebook. And then there's our newsletter, which you can sign up on the website, which is kindfulbody.com. And then I'm leading a retreat actually with two colleagues, Jean Catanzaro and Teresa Chestnut, in March in Chester, Connecticut. And we have a couple more spaces open for that upcoming retreat. And I do some consultation groups as well. And then the IFS Telehealth Collective, I can imagine lots of folks are interested in internal family systems therapy, and we're in 6 states. So we're also a resource. I'm a co-founder with, as you mentioned, Paul Gettner and Mario Pastor. And we're in California, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon, Michigan, and Florida. And we also are on social media and have a newsletter and provide resources for folks. So if anyone's interested in IFS, they can find out more about us at IFS Therapy Online.
Well, it's amazing all the wonderful things that you're doing and involved with. And I want to wish you much energy. And I see the passion in your face as you're talking about these things. So I'm just think we're lucky to have you doing the work you're doing in the world. And I look forward to seeing what comes next for you and maybe a future conversation.
I would love that, Patty. This has been great. I had a great time today, and thank you for doing the amazing work that you're doing. It's so needed, and I'm so happy that you're launching this podcast. I'm glad to be a guest.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. Until next time.